Welcome to this episode of Litong Litalks about subversive texts. I am Syreen, or you can call me Sai, whatever works for you. I'll be your moderator slash host for this episode. This episode will primarily be focusing on two literary works, which is Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury and One of These Days by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So this part of the episode will be focusing on a faculty panel discussion regarding the contextual and academic backgrounds of these texts to kind of guide us through the context of the worlds in which these texts exist in. So or tackle. So to do that, we have invited two guests to who have kind of a more ample amount of background in literature. So we have our professors, Ma'am Bethina and Sir Percy. So hi, Ma'am Bethina and Sir Percy. Welcome. Welcome to Litong Litaks. We hope you're as excited as we are for this conversation. So first, let's discuss kind of the the concepts that are primarily the topic of these works. I feel like the commonality that exists between these two works, that's why they were chosen for this episode, is there's kind of that element of subversion as opposed regarding the status quo in the worlds that are tackled in the two stories. No, so to enlighten the people eavesdropping in this conversation, can you give us like a background or a meaning on what subversive writing means and what do you think is its contribution to humanity? So, Ma'am Bettina?
Oh, okay. I want to define subversive writing in terms of Latin America because this text that I'm gonna be focusing on is about Gabriel Garcia Marquez and his use of Latin America. So this text was not published in any of his collections. This is a very rare text, and I use this text whenever I'm discussing creative writing of how a short story can become a novel. Obviously, the difference between a short story and a novel is the subplots, but with regard to how subversive it is with the themes, I have to emphasize on the use of magical realism as its technique. Remember, magical realism is it's the way of protest literature in Latin America. Latin America or South American literature is filled with so much of civil war, the Thousand Days War, Generalissimo Franco, left and right. You still see it until today that there is still dictatorship in that part of the globe, and the only way that they can protest without getting themselves killed is to write in literature, hence the existence of magical realism. It's not something that out blunt like revolution that you have there. That's why I love the marriage or the juxtaposition of these two texts because they're some way different, but at the same time there are similar themes to them. So Fahrenheit 451 was more upfront with its subversive literature. Unlike here, the subtlety of Latin American culture, of Latin American writing, it's expressed in the magical realism. This text doesn't particularly highlight out the magical realism, but any text in Latin America that calls for a focus on memory especially is something that is really is it's a major theme in Latin America.
And if I may second what Bettina mentioned already, in Latin America, it's very much concealed, so to speak.
Mm-mm.
Unlike what we're going to talk about in Fahrenheit 451, it's upfront. And for us to be able to just like have a very layman's understanding of what subversion writing is, of course, it's very much different when you approach Latin American text, very creative at that matter, but at that manner rather. But for the general public, we can talk about subversive writing as a writing that urges people to speak or think for themselves, or empower them to think for themselves and to probably question whatever they think is unreliable or questionable, or if not, cannot be trusted. Okay, to an extent, the oppressive ones. Okay, and I guess this leads to creation of a society which cannot be taken for granted, and where the common people can, get to have their own voice in the real sense, not just the ones in power. And that subversive writing is very upfront, so to speak, no, in the text that I'm about to discuss later on, which is Fahrenheit 451. Very different, no, different worlds from the in America, of course, other than the subversive writing part of it. We know that it's the colonized area,
Mhm.
and what I'm going to talk about is very much more the colonizer, the one that's the
Exactly.
oppressive
Yeah.
one. Yeah,
Since you
great.
touched upon those literary works po, Sir Percy, can you give us like a summary of Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury? So just we would be more into that context.
Sure. This is the story of a person named Guy Montag. If you have encountered the story, you probably would remember the name. He's the protagonist of Fahrenheit 451, and he's a fireman. Okay, and of course we know a fireman is someone who puts off fire. But in this context, it's different. Okay, he's a fireman, and the context is he's someone who creates fire. Very ironic. Okay, and we're gonna explain that further later on. And that fireman, Guy Montag, is someone who not puts up fire, no, but someone who creates fire. And the story is set in the 24th century United States, very futuristic. Okay, Guy lives in the United States of the future, where reading and owning books are illegal. Okay, if you own a book, if you read a book, the controversial ones, the scientific ones, it's very much illegal in their context. Okay, it's actually titled Fahrenheit 451 because it takes 451 degrees Fahrenheit to burn a paper. So that's where the title comes from. And I don't want to bore you with the entire summary of the story, but what I want to emphasize is basically number one, books must be burned because they breed confusion and discontent in the context of the story. Okay, and that speaks a lot about the direction of our podcast today. You know, they cause people to question. In the story, they question happiness that is mandated by the ministry. Okay, in that particular novel, no, and the whole purpose is happiness, and people are encouraged to engage in behaviors that promote that feeling of happiness. While the novel is most often classified as a work of science fiction, we know that in the story, it primarily is I would say, a social criticism on several matters that is still relevant today, such as censorship, the issue of power relations, and to some extent, the devaluing of facts or the neglect of history, as well as, of course, critical thinking in exchange for a pseudo happiness and peace. In the story, we know that the people of in the novel are conditioned by the ministry to adhere to a certain behavior to be happy. And those actions that would lead you to happiness are the ones that are fake, the ones that are temporary, the ones that are instant. So they're forgetting the deeper part of humanity in exchange for something that they call happiness and peace. Okay, I just told you I talk a lot, no? It also talks about unchecked oppressive government damages in society by limiting the creativity and freedom of its people. We see that in the story by, you know, referring to books and art as graffiti. Okay, something that is not as important as the way we look at books, which is basically the symbol for wisdom and creativity for art. So these things are the enemies in the story. They are depicted as the enemies. It's a dystopian, futuristic, or imagined technocratic or totalitarian or both, okay, kind of society being depicted in the story that demands order and harmony at the expense of what? Individual rights and freedom. Okay, of course, the flavoring, so to speak, of dystopia in the story, I guess, is trying to also conceal the main intent in a more creative manner so that they can just go straight to the point and be banned when the story was written. But similar to a lot of the magical realism writings where everything is concealed, and not concealed for the sake of hiding it, no, but for the sake of probably confusing the ones that are being directed in the story, in the message of the story. So I guess that's an overview of Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury.
Actually, sir, I love how you said that knowledge becomes the trade-off for that instant gratification that people get from the system. So for the summary of one of these days, Ma'am Bettina, can you like give us that summary?
I don't know if I can still summarize this. This is less than 1,000 page, less than 1,000 words. It's just literally flash fiction. But okay, it's literally a dictator, and being showing the human side of him, I guess. And then because he had a toothache for several days already, and then he needed to go to the dentist, so the dentist pulls out his tooth, and then but the dentist was in protest at first. He only pulled out the tooth out of duress when a gun was pointed out to his head, and his daughter, his child, was also being threatened. And with no choice, he said, I'll pull out the tooth without anesthesia because there are already pus in it, and then he still did it. But at the end, you can see that the control, who is in control here? That's the main question of the short story. Who is in control here? Because after he pulled out the tooth, he said, "This is for payment for the 20 men, for the 20 dead men." And then the dictator said, "To whom?" To whom do I send the bill to you or to the town? And then he said, this is what I love about it. The last line, does it matter? Because he is corrupt. The dictator is corrupt. The money that he will send, it doesn't matter who came where it came from, whom it came from, because at the end of the day, the money that he's going to pay for his tooth is from the people itself. So yeah, in essence, that's the summary without the analyzation part yet of the of the text.
Actually, I also got chills after reading that last line of the text. Not just because it embodies that corruption of money, but also corruption of power when you equate yourself to your state. When that line between you and the state becomes blurry, you then become beyond criticism. So that's kind of my understanding when I read it. So what I'm curious, what are the things you find similar about the systems and the experiences in Fahrenheit 451 and one of these days, both conceptually or theoretically?
Okay, I'll add first muna to what I just said. It's both both of these stories were published 50s for Fahrenheit 451, 1962 for one of these days. If you look at the timeline of when it happened, so Spain was also still under civil unrest, and then 1950s in the States was still the liberal period. But when you piece down together, whatever did they wrote a few eons ago, the topic is still happening now. It's still relevant in today's society. So that is one of the similarities. We don't want to say that it's a bit prophetic in a way, but it mainly tells us the favorite quote or the favorite poem that I've always read is this is by this is from the this is from Yeats, William Butler Yeats. Turning and turning the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loose upon the world. So I think this explores both of these texts explores the beauty of literature that when if we still don't learn from the structure of the past, we will end up still in this same structure because it's one thing to presume that there is no because there is really no way to get out of these kinds of structure, and the structure that I'm talking about is the social structure. And but it's one thing to know about structure and another to presume that the structure doesn't matter.
Sir Percy?
I was actually still struck by that question towards the end of the story. Does it matter? And that's basically, I guess, a question that we should ask. We should be asking each other today, just like what Bettina already mentioned. There's some kind of like a foreshadowing of the future, not a prophetic one for that matter. And does it really matter? Definitely. One of the things that I guess I want to focus on is the issue of oppression. And that oppression is seen similarly in both stories, but in different ways. One is very conscious, and Fahrenheit 451 is basically just it, di ba? The conscious way of, or the very obvious way of putting oppression in the story. And the other one is a very subtle one, a very subconscious one for that matter. But for the Fahrenheit 451, the story, oppression is seen in the way the ministry, the one that leads the society back then, in the story rather, the way they were conditioned with with their lives, with how they pursue happiness. Imagine happiness is prescribed by the state. Happiness is not your own choice. Happiness is not the way you pursue whatever you want. But happiness is prescribed. This is happiness according to the state. And I want to quote from the story. I actually got this one from the novel itself. At the beginning of the novel, Montag reveals his character by telling himself his real feelings. According to him, happy of all the nonsense he felt, his smile slide away. He was not happy. He was not happy, he said. He said the word to himself. He recognized this as his true state of affairs. He wore his happiness like a mask. And it's all because of, and that sets the tone of the story. It's all because happiness is conditioned by a bigger system. For you to be happy, you should do the following. Number one, have more television instead of books. Okay. Number two, get the immediate gratification of things instead of going through the nitty gritty of exploring life. And of course, I don't want to bore you with too much details, but that kind of oppression where everything is dictated by the system, where books are being banned because that triggers you to be critical about their own leadership, is just like what Bethina said, kind of prophetic or a foreshadowing of what's basically happening today, not just in the Philippines, though, but even across the globe. You hear a lot of stories about oppression. You hear a lot of stories about people being conditioned by the powerful, by the few ones, if not us being demonized for being critical. You see a
That
lot of red flags
capitalism
right
for
here,
sure.
right? And I think I should stop, but that's basically one of the things that is obvious in the story Fahrenheit 451, that idea of oppression, which is still today happening.
Yeah, I'd like to add what Percy said about the unmasking, the quotation of that, because these are narratives at the end of the day. Fahrenheit 451, and one of these days. But at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, when you are repeatedly framing these kinds of narratives, when we are positioning the subject to a certain kind of ideology, and the dangerous part is that if ideology, because ideology is the sum total, the belief of a system, diba? It's not like, okay, next term, elective, mag-enroll kayo, racism, sexism. Diba wala? Because ideology is something that is so common sense. But um, the danger is lies that when we presume that the ideology, that the myth is authentic, that porket, okay, babae ako, that what I think of or what I say of is the authentic experience ng kababaihan. 'Di ba hindi? So, am I speaking for all womankind? No, of course not. I'm speaking for myself. And that is the danger of ideology, because you presume that it's common sense. You somehow you are framing this kind of alienation. Tama nga si Sir Percy, kasi kinokondisyon na tayo. And pag nag-subject na tayo sa condition na yon, we are part of the structure itself.
That kind of reminds me about the work of Althusser about ideological state apparatuses and repressive state apparatuses. Diba? It's so common to us that we don't think twice when we do it or when we speak about it, because it's just so deeply indoctrinated and ingrained. So in Fahrenheit 451, there was a removal of literature and culture. So, Sir Percy, I'm curious, how does this experience influence empathy between people?
That's a very interesting question. In the story, people didn't want books because they were conditioned not to want books. Okay, so they wanted snippets and catchphrases. For example, there's an instance in the story where Hamlet, I guess if I'm not mistaken, one of the works of Shakespeare was reduced to like a catchy phrase. And for you to say that I have already read the classics by just reading a catchy phrase, you can confidently say that in the book because everything is reduced into immediate gratification. So you see that there's a removal of literature. There's a removal of books as a symbol of critical thinking, of intellectualization in the story. And consider in our own society that shift from books to, for example, magazine or Facebook to, Twitter to TikTok, di ba? There's much more emphasis now on what is immediate, what is popular, instead of going back to, to literature, going back to the classics, going back to history. I'm not demonizing these social platforms. I have all of them and I enjoy it. But what I'm simply saying is that for majority, not just in the novel, no, but even in our context today, there's that immediate glorification of what is shorter, what is for them better, diba? What is visual compared to going to the powerful literary pieces and of course all of these historical books that we have been reading when we were younger. Okay, now people only want a visual snapshot. Even the dozen words on Twitter sometimes feel so long. Lagi tayong into shorter one, into the immediate one, and that's very much present in the story. Books are even illegal. Hoarding. Look at this term. Illegal book hoarding. Diba? How many of you listening right now, you are hoarding books? Diba? When there are, for example, book sale here and there, diba? Lit major kayo, you know the feeling of kilig every time you see book sales. A
And
month
just
or, diba? Naka-schedule. And then when you hoard a lot of books, you put it in your storage. Sometimes you don't read it anymore. You don't have time. But just the idea of hoarding, may maraming tinamaan, no? But just the idea of hoarding books, diba? It's there. But in the novel, it's illegal to hoard books. Much more to read books. Okay, and there are so many instances. Allow me to read one. One of the characters in the story, I think her name is Betty. She explains why books became unpopular. It's because they had content that offended the minorities. That was explicitly said in the story in their civilization. Okay, the books are offending some people, some group of people. Everyone was offended by something in the book, so burning them made it so that people don't have to read them anymore. Read any more offensive content. BT states, I quoted here, someone's written a book, for example, on tobacco and cancer of the lungs. Cigarette people are weeping and they're feeling offended. I cannot smoke anymore because you wrote something about lung cancer. Let's burn that book. And that immediate that's crazy, but that's happening in the story. Imagine whoever those minorities are being offended right here and there. And sometimes it also is similar to what we are seeing outside. People are very much overreacting on certain matters, even on facts. For example, you present a fact and then some people will say that's offensive, that's not true, here and there. And again, I'm not pointing at anything, but I'm just stating what the book inspires me to say. You know what I'm talking about. Okay, may pakita tayo naman dyan, di ba? But that's true. And that's the I think one of the interesting part of the story. And again, I'll go back to what Ma'am Bethina said, very much a foreshadowing, or if not a prophecy, of sadly what's happening in our context today.
actually, from the perspective of a Gen Z in today's society, that you can really see that a lot from our generation kind of puts more premium on what they watch on a 7-second TikTok video rather than what they would read inside the classroom. And my thought whenever I see these instances is that I really do not have the heart to blame them, because not everyone has the privilege to go into a classroom and not worry about their expenses. So sometimes the best they can have to the closest they have to an access to education is a 7-second video on TikTok. So it's kind of more of the lacks in our system than the choices of the masses. So in
Let me put some disclaimer on what I said. I just realized that I said that people are easily offended, and that's true. But allow me to also say this. So there's nothing wrong with being offended. There are issues today that deserves people to be offended. When you talk about racism, for example, Black Lives Matter, people that are not part of LGBT and trying to represent them in a very wrong way, you would be offended. And I guess that's a legitimate feeling. But what's crazy about the story, about the book that I'm talking about, is they're offended by facts. That one is crazy. You're offended by facts. You're not able to handle the truth because it is not what you want to hear. Right? I'm smoking. I love smoking. Why would you write something about lung cancer? That's offensive. Dude, that's crazy. But if you are offended by, centuries of misrepresentation in your race, in your gender, then you deserve to be offended. And not just offend and stop there, but you deserve to put an action to it. I'm not
Exactly.
mad. I'm just, that's,
Exactly, sir. I completely agree. When it's the truth that makes you uncomfortable and your
I,
knee-jerk reaction is to shut down that very truth, or that's kind of a dangerous thing for society.
exactly.
So, Bethina, in one of these days, there is a lack of access to education, as we have mentioned a while ago, and also safety and stability. How does this convey commentaries on humanization and empathy?
It conveys that there's dictatorship, there is a one-sidedness, there's an imbalance to society that it's not only it's sad to say that it's not only fictional. We see here in one of these days that it's a very, very corrupt society, that it was very beautifully described. I mean, Marquez really has a gift of words. He's really a genius. 'Di ba, how the cobwebs in that dentist office, how very dilapidated that office is. And for you, a dictator, a representation of leadership in the country, for you to really need that facility, to have access to to a clean bill of health, it speaks that of man's greed, man's unending greed, especially for those who are in control of power, because we are always so preoccupied with this so-called epiphany moment that we're looking for relevance, that at the end of the day, I hate to go medyo gasgas na siya, and medyo sa thesis ko din siya, knowledge is really indeed power. Foko, 'di ba? Whoever has the most control of knowledge, he has the most way of how to control power. At the end of the day, it's all about the power structure, and it's very evident in Latin American literature, and it's not just in this text, but when that scales of power, that's the beauty of one of these days, when that scales of power is somehow tiptoed by a single act of getting the tooth without any anesthesia, and it's inside of a pus na, imagine dictator ka na namamaga na ilang araw na yun, 'di ba? And then without anesthesia, so that kind of temporary or a marginal bliss for the character, for the main character, Aurelio. And then, yeah, that in one way, he was at one point he was the one who was with power. At the end of the day, it's all about power relations. So with regards to empathy, we could say that Aurelio, even though na he really hates the dictator and such, at the end of the day, he still followed his Hippocratic oath and became a dentist. He said na, oh, don't he said certain instruction na wash with salt, i-cold compress mo yan, and so on. Hindi niya kumbaga, he didn't added fuel to the fire. Hindi niya pinalala na yung infection, right? So at the end of the day, you can still see here the juxtaposition na Aurelio, even though he was really tempted to, somehow you can murder naman kasi, 'di ba? You're in a vulnerable state when you're getting your tooth operated, but he didn't. He just yes, the grabbing of the tooth without anesthesia is a demonstration of power, but at the end of the day, he did his work as a dentist. He didn't initiate any more combative relations, 'di ba? So that's where the empathy in this particular story is.
Actually, another commonality, if I may say, with these two texts is that they communicate this importance of memory. What is the importance of writing and memory in these experiences of the masses and the state of their governing systems?
I want to emphasize one thing, and that is collective forgetfulness is a dangerous thing. Of course, we can always talk about individual forgetting of something or someone. That's just fine. It's normal. But a collective, a communal forgetfulness is a very dangerous thing to happen. Don't forget that. Okay, do not forget that collective forgetfulness. It's a dangerous thing, and this can happen in many ways. Forgetting that we have, for example, the liberty to think for ourselves because we are conditioned to operate on a certain way. like what's happening in Fahrenheit 451, they are not allowed to formulate their own informed opinion, hence the book burning. Okay, forgetting that there are much more important things in life other than temporary and immediate gratification, temporary happiness, or what they call as peace, which is not really peaceful, but just trying to order everyone to behave in a certain manner, or just being conditioned. This is how we should perceive life and happiness and peace. And if we follow that, then we're good. But that's not freedom at all. You're being led to just do something. You are losing your authenticity as an individual, and so much more, which was seen in the novel as well, where peace and happiness is basically prescribed instead of pursued. Okay, instead of individuality or individually and creatively discovering the pursuit of your uniqueness, your expression, you are you are conditioned to just behave in a certain way. Okay, forgetting the facts of the past is also another thing that is emphasized in the story. Why is memory and writing important? Because it gives us accountability of what has happened in the past and what we don't want to happen again in the future, in the present and in the future. And sadly, not just in the Philippines, but when you look at world news, it's happening. Why are there still people crying out for Black Lives Matter? It has been addressed, I believe, centuries ago, but we never learn. It is repeated and repeated over and over again because of forgetfulness. Again, I want to go back to what I just said. Collective forgetfulness is a dangerous thing, and I hope that we will not fall to that trap of forgetting deliberately or being conditioned to forget what has happened in the past. How do we look at our instructional materials in the schools? How are the historical facts represented in our textbooks, in our lessons? These are subtle ways of the powerful to omit something so that we will forget deliberately the past. It's a dangerous thing.
Do you think that, in the Philippine context at least, do you think that colonialism has played a very important role in that conversation regarding the forgetfulness of society, di ba, as a whole? So, Ma'am Bettina, if you have any thoughts on that.
I like to quote Fanon, Franz Fanon. He said that colonialism is not merely, I'm quoting from memory here. Feel free to explore the direct quote of it. Colonialism is not contented with just simply erasing the memory. No, you have to empty the native's mind of that memory and reconfigure a whole new generation of system of its own. Friend, I think he wrote this on national culture. That's the essay that it's come to mind. Which brings me to my point. If accord, I love the term Percy about collective forgetfulness, and I will raise another term by Eric Gamalinda. This is imagined memory. If collective forgetfulness is really dangerous, so as an imagined memory. So this is also something similar to the Mandela effect, wherein your brain immediately thought of something happened, but it didn't. This is very, very crucial and very, very dangerous because you are in a way positioning again a certain kind of happening that never really happened, and that is what colonialism did. But again, like what I've said before, the ideology of colonialism. I'm going to go now to Gayatari Spivak, Can the Subaltern Speak? Sub meaning other, and then sub meaning under, and then altern meaning other, right? But yeah, kahit sinong ugok naman dyan pwede magsalita, di ba? But talking
Exactly.
is different from speaking. And like what I've said earlier, just because porket gay siya, so malicious na siya. Porket black siya, oppressed na kagad. Again, no. No one can be a representation of an una persona Tagala or a collective memory. No one it can be in possession of that. Na porket babae ako, na porket I support LGBTIQ. Therefore, I also speak for them because this ideology of addressing the subject is really powerful because it's not being taught in classroom. It's as powerful as mythology. Ganun, and that's how colonialism plays the part there, di ba?
Exactly, it's as powerful as mythology. Wow, exactly, yeah. It's so normalized. It manifests in everything.